And now we are going to head right into our next panel, the expansion into new technologies with synthetic fuels. So I want to talk more about this now with Mats Hultman, if you'll join me on stage, Mats. He is the head of OEM partnerships at NESTE. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
We also have Clara Bowman, the general manager at HIF, or Highly Innovative Fuels Global. A warm welcome to you there, Clara.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here today.
And Ralf Diemer is also joining us. He is the CEO of the eFuel Alliance. So before we get started with the discussion, Clara, I understand that you would like to show us a video before we get the panel going.
Yes, I thought it could be a way for us to get started and get excited about the eFuel potential that we have. So I'd like to share a short video with you, if that's okay.
Of course.
Weather vanes turn, anemometers turn, windmills turn, wheels turn on cars, on planes, on machines. The earth turns, and today our world is being turned upside down. An idea is brewing in the south that will revolutionize the way we make fuel. An idea as ambitious as it is achievable, as innovative as it is necessary. And what better than the wind to turn things around? An endless supply of clean energy, a force of nature that, if harnessed correctly, can perform miracles. Like making fuel out of the air. Decarbonizing it and helping stop global warming before it's too late. A fuel powerful enough to lift the largest airplane in the world and move the biggest ship. It may seem impossible, but not in Chile, where the winds are as mighty as what we can achieve with them. We're turning over a new page in our history. We're setting a new course. We're using nature to heal nature. We're bringing to life a dream so big that it will change the future for all of us.
I want to thank you very much for that introduction film. When talking about e-fuels and synthetic fuels, an argument that often comes up is it's too expensive and inefficient. And Mats, I want to ask, what is your response to the critics?
Yeah, I think you have to consider what is the price of fossil fuel. Is it the right price we have today? And what is the price of carbon emissions? So I think that discussion will continue, and we have to start looking at not only what is the price of the new product, how do we price the existing ones. Of course, as volumes go up and we see more producers, the prices will come down. But initially, as with all new technology, the prices are a bit higher. So.
And Clara, do you have anything that you'd like to add to the critics?
Yeah, I think that it's important to realize that when we start doing these things at scale, just like Matt said, the price comes down considerably. And when we talk about efficiency, if we're able to do these kind of projects in the places where the renewable energy is at the lowest cost and is most abundant, then we actually don't care so much about efficiency, because the total price of the product is something that makes sense when you take into account the externalities that Matt's also mentioned about, the impact of carbon emissions. So I think that as we see these projects develop in the future, we're going to see extremely competitive e-fuels, both with traditional low carbon fuels such as biofuels, and eventually also with fossil fuels.
And Ralf, do you have anything to add about claims that it's too inexpensive or too expensive and inefficient?
Well, I think there are 2 points we have to distinct, because about pricing, Mats and Clara already talked. We always hear this efficiency argument, and that's of course right if you see it through a only, for example, German perspective. Because we will never have enough renewable energy which we need to produce these fuels, only in Germany or even in Europe to produce all what we need in the future. And that is why it is so important that we think more globally when we talk about the investments and the production, because indeed, as Clara said, there are a lot of places in the world where you have much better conditions than in Europe. But on the other hand, we need to very much focus on the regulatory framework in Europe to create a market, actually, because that is also a problem we haven't solved at all.
Yeah.
And if there is no market, there will be no investments, or at least the outcome of the investments will not be in Europe, but maybe in other parts of the world. Because I'm very sure that, for example, our Chinese competitors are as keen on e-fuels as we are. So we are in a global market, and we are in a global competition here as well.
Clara, you're in Chile. I want to ask what the potential of generating hydrogen and e-fuels is there, and what kind of products does HIF offer?
Well, at the moment, we're developing some very large-scale methanol to gasoline projects, but we're also interested in producing the other e-fuels that are possible, such as e-diesel and e-jet fuel. But in terms of the potential that we have, I think that it's helpful to think about just with our projects ourselves. So we think in the south of Chile, the best renewable energy in the world. And we have developed at the moment 12 gigawatts of prime energy, and we're developing that. And to have a kind of idea of what that means in terms of the amount of e-fuels that we can produce, with that, with our trains that we have in development, we would be able to, by say 2030 or a little bit afterwards, have in construction or operation the same amount of gasoline production that Chile consumes in a year. And so when you think about that kind of power to be able to accelerate, it's really important. That sort of outcome with electric vehicles by themselves would be really difficult to imagine. And Chile itself not only has the areas in the south where we're developing the projects, but also incredible renewable energy in the north, which is more solar-based. So we think that as costs come down, then those kind of areas are also going to open up, and this will be an extremely important export commodity for Chile.
So speaking of costs, Mats, I want to ask you, what do you think the estimated cost for a liter of e-fuel will be once production is scaled up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, looking at the products that we have now at Neste with our renewable diesels and so on, we see that, as we talked about before, scaling up means lower cost. It will also depend, as we see with renewable diesel today, on the tax situation in different countries. So I think it will vary country by country. We see with renewable diesel that we're almost on par with the fossil diesel in some countries. And I think we will see a similar situation with the e-fuels for the consumers, that some countries will probably, it would probably come close to the fossil price. But as I said in the beginning also, the question is, should the fossil price stay where it is? Is it really reasonable? And how do we price carbon emissions, basically?
Clara, I want to ask you, because you're all the way over in Chile and we're here in Berlin, how do we get these fuels and your technology thousands of miles across the ocean to Europe and other regions in the world, but in a sustainable way?
Well, that's a really common question. And actually, it's surprising how little the impact is on the overall carbon intensity of the fuel, the transport, even if you're transporting from a place like Chile to Europe. And that's because we're not talking about transporting hydrogen. People often confuse the two, which is a very difficult substance to transport. We're transporting regular fuels. And so the impact that we'd have in a litre of fuel is around about 5% in the overall carbon intensity, moving it from Chile to Europe. And that's if we move it with regular fuels. And so we're seeing more and more a movement of the shipping industry. And I think actually Maersk came out just recently with an announcement that they're building $1.4 billion in new ships that they hope to run on green methanol. So we're seeing more and more transition in the shipping industry towards looking at sustainable fuels. And obviously, if we're able to use our own fuels to transport the fuels, then we're not having any kind of carbon impact at all.
Ralf, I want to ask you, what do you think the problems are with the current regulations?
As I said, in Europe, the regulatory framework is in a way that we don't have real market incentives to invest into e-fuels. The eFuel Alliance, actually, that's the reason why the eFuel Alliance exists. The goal is to change this framework because that's absolutely key to get this uptake done. So just 3 short examples. We have a CO2 regulation in place for cars, vans and trucks in Europe. They are pure so-called tailpipe regulations, so they measure only the CO2 emissions at a tailpipe.
Yeah.
They don't ask where the energy, the car, whatever car it is run by, where this is coming from. So that that's the result of that is that actually an electric car always has 0 emissions, even if it's run by 100% coal energy. A combustion engine car, which is run by renewable fuels, 100% renewable fuels, always will have a CO2 value because it's an internal combustion process going on in this car. That regulation is simply wrong. So we need a crediting system also for alternative fuels there. And at the end of the day, we need to open up this regulation for an approach which also includes the way how the energy is produced, because that's key for climate protection. We want, at the end of the day, less CO2 emissions. Second example is the Renewable Energy Directive, which is also key for investments, especially also by the oil industry, for example. There again, we have a advantage for electrification because you can encounter as energy provider, for example, as an oil company, you can invest in charging infrastructure for electric cars. This is counted in several ways there, so you have an advantage. If you offer e-fuels, you don't have this advantage. So this is also wrong. We need a different approach here as well. And the third, and even maybe more important, is the pricing. And that starts with taxation. E-fuels in the moment coming as gasoline or diesel or other ways are taxed as in the same way as fossil fuels. Because the energy density is the parameter used in the energy taxation. And that is wrong, that has to be changed. The CO2 footprint has to be key again here, because again, we talk about climate protection at the end of the day. If we manage to change these 3 regulations, and we have a big chance now to do so, because the Commission put all these regulations on the table right now, then there will be a chance for a real market uptake for e-fuels, which, by the way, includes also hydrogen, because that is also part of the value chain, and everybody talks about the need of hydrogen as well.
Mats, what would you like to add in terms of regulations? What needs to happen there?
Yeah, I think Ralf summarized it quite well here. I mean, we're also focusing a lot on this tailpipe emission, that it needs to change and look at the total well-to-wheel perspective. And we also see that the current regulation is driving the technology into only electrification. And I think that's the wrong way to go, because we need technology neutrality. The key is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, not to have as many electric vehicles as possible on the roads. And here I think sometimes we get a bit lost when we talk about what we really want to achieve. We actually need even more electric vehicles than are planned to replace all the fossil fuels. But in parallel with that, we need the renewable fuels, the e-fuels and so on also. So,
Clara, I want to ask you, what is your perspective on regulations?
Well, my perspective comes from being an infrastructure developer. And so what we want is certainty. And we need to know, I mean, the investments that we want to make, if we talk about a large scale, global scale e-fuels train, we're talking about, say, $3.5 billion. And a lot of the income that we have will come from the regulatory framework that is set up in Europe. And so we really need, as soon as possible, for the RED III regulations to be very clear. We need to have comfort that over time, those provisions are going to be grandfathered. We've seen a lot of regulatory change, I think, going in the right direction, which is positive. But when you go and talk to banks about it, obviously they're very concerned to say, okay, well, how are these regulations going to be modified or changed over time? And so for us to be able to start taking the investments that we need to be able to get these products in the market as soon as possible and be attacking climate change as quickly as possible, we need to have the regulatory certainty that allows us to move forward with those investments. So for us, I'd say having comfort around the current regulations and their effect over time is critical.
So Ralf, do you think that the combustion engine cars should still be manufactured, new ones, or should we just use the ones that we already have and only go electric? What is your view on that?
Yeah, that's a very difficult debate, especially here in Germany right now, because when you are promoting the combustion engine, you are perceived as kind of an old-fashioned guy who is promoting old-fashioned outgoing technologies. So I don't have a problem with a combustion engine car run by e-fuels because it can be as climate neutral as an electric car. But also the electric car has to be run with renewable energies. Mm-hmm. And this is a big problem we have in many countries in Europe right now, as in Germany, because we have a lot of coal and gas energy in the grid. So there are no zero emission cars. I think what we need is, as Matt said, technology neutrality. I would like to see a competition between technologies. Because if we manage to make the energy CO2 free or less CO2 contained, then of course it doesn't really matter which technology you use, for example, for transport. This goes for other areas as well, by the way. We talk about industry as well, chemistry, steel. They all need hydrogen, for example, in huge amounts. So if we see this as a competition and also as a systematic approach to connect all the modes together, then I think we will come to the best results for climate protection. I don't want to have ideological debates about technologies. I hope that we will see more electric cars because in some ways they make sense. And if at the end of the day in a market the consumers decide to electrify because they have to buy at the end of the day, it's not politicians, then so be it. That's fine with me. But again, also for these cars we need renewable energy. And there we are by far not where we should be, especially when I see it from a European perspective. And may I add a last word? I mean, the car industry, I was working for the car industry for 15 years. It is a very global industry. So I don't think that if Europe decides to get rid of the combustion engine, that will be done in the same way in South America, for example, or in China, which is by far the biggest market right now. So in a global perspective, we will only see the effect that Mercedes and BMW and Volkswagen and others are start to produce combustion engine cars simply elsewhere and not in Europe anymore. I don't think this is an approach we should promote. It's simply wrong.
Thank you for that. Mats, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the product that Neste is offering. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so we make renewable diesel and jet fuels from waste and residues. Okay. And it's a drop-in solution, so you can use the existing infrastructures and the existing engines that are out there. So it's very easy to switch over to being sustainable. And it's made from different type of waste and residues. So and we source those globally, and it can be anything from used cooking oil to animal fats. And we have them production in Finland, in Rotterdam, and in Singapore, where we produce these fuels.
And how expensive is this technology, and is it something that anyone can drive?
You mean how expensive is the fuel to use? Yes, as I talked a little bit before, it is slightly more expensive, and it differs a little bit country by country. In some countries it's about 10 cents more, it could be 20 cents more, but we see that consumers are interested in this and being more sustainable, and many companies also has this as part of their decarbonization plans and so on. And comparing the cost to decarbonize by using this type of renewable fuels compared to many other solutions, it's very cost competitive.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the drop-in structure, and how easy is it just to convert the existing infrastructure that we already have to be adapted to these kind of fuels?
It's actually no adoption needed. You could just switch by filling with this fuel, and you could use the existing filling, the tanks, the filling stations, everything. So it's fully compatible, both the fuel for road traffic, but also the aviation fuel. So it's really easy to make the switch.
Okay,
Yep.
it's already there.
Yep.
Clara, I want to ask you, what is the outlook worldwide for synthetic fuels, do you think?
Well, we think that this is going to be the next great infrastructure play that we're going to see developing worldwide. We've seen an explosion with renewable energies over the last 10 years, and we expect to see something similar happen with e-fuels for all of the reasons that Ralf was mentioning regarding the need to accelerate towards a global solution to climate change. We see that electric vehicles also are an extremely important part of that, but in many developing countries and in many developed countries for quite some time, we're going to need to be able to have a solution to road transport, to shipping, to airline fuels that frankly doesn't exist if we don't have e-fuels. And so we are really expecting this to be a massive development in terms of infrastructure over the next 5 to 10 years.
Ralf, I want to ask you, when it comes to speed and performance, do e-fuels have the upper hand on electric vehicles?
That's a good question. Actually, it depends, again, on the regulation. Right now, car companies are in Europe at least, and it's the same in parts of the United States, for example, are heavily forced and also subsidized to bring electric cars into the market. I don't think this will go away. So yes, we will see a quite quick uptake on electric cars. Of course, you could argue if you would have enough e-fuels in the market, then of course, for a lot of customers, it would be much easier and also cheaper at the end of the day, because they don't need to buy a new car, to run their car more CO2 neutral than today with fossil fuels. That could lead to an extension of combustion engine technology in the future. But as I said, I don't think this is a real problem, because at the end of the day, the goal must be to run all technologies CO2 neutral. So that is why I think we shouldn't argue in that way about technologies. How you can, just 2 quick examples how regulation works. As I said, we have zero emission regulation by tailpipe in Europe right now. Mm-hmm. That means, for example, for trucks, that you can run an electric truck as a zero-emission truck, you can run a hydrogen fuel cell truck as a zero-emission truck, and you can run a hydrogen combustion truck, which is very, very close to zero-emission as well. If you run a diesel truck with e-fuels, it wouldn't be a zero-emission truck, because it has still the internal combustion engine and a CO2 value. That leads to the fact that, for example, some truck manufacturers don't want e-fuels, but they want hydrogen. The question is, where is coming the hydrogen from? At the end of the day, the hydrogen is coming from the same sources as e-fuels come, because it's the part of a same process, with the exception that hydrogen is very much more difficult to transport than e-fuels. So another example was, I was talking to a colleague in America, in the United States, from Texas. He's running a company developing fast charging stations for electric cars based on e-fuels. So they are producing e-fuels, in that case it was gas, methanol, to run fast charging power stations for cars. I said, that's ridiculous, why are you doing that? The grid in most parts of the United States is so bad that you cannot very much use fast charging from the normal grid. And he said, regulatory-wise, nobody wants to hear something about e-fuels run in combustion engines right now. So that leads to these kind of processes which are slowing down the process at the end of the day, because you cannot use the eFuel to run your old Ford F-150, for example, to run it CO2 free. But you have to buy an electric Ford F-150, which is on the market right now. Then you can, to charge CO2 free, the energy at a fast charging station which is run by eFuels. That is ridiculous. And I think we have to address, because we have the same tendency in Europe as well, we have to address these kind of policies, because they are slowing us down at the end of the day. We will not achieve our climate goals in that way.
So it sounds like there's a definite disconnect in terms of regulation.
Yes, I would say so.
Mats, I want to ask you, where do you see e-fuels in 5 or 10 years from now?
Yeah, we see it's a new technology that is coming, and it will play a bigger and bigger role here in the future. In our plans, we have projected it to start playing a really big role here around 2030. There will be now projects coming up and running, and that's really good to see. But I think for the general public, somewhere 5 to 10 years will be where you start seeing it more publicly available. That's at least our estimations of the market.
And Clara, what do you have to say about that? Where do you see things in 5 to 10 years from now?
No, I completely agree. We have, as I mentioned, a big portfolio of projects. We're building our first demonstration plant at the moment, which is going to be producing next year. And then we hope to start construction on our first commercial scale project towards the end of next year as well. And so we're going to be producing the first liters of eFuel that will be exported to Europe. And it's a trend that we think, as I mentioned before, is going to be huge, because ultimately I think, and this is something that Ralf mentioned, people underestimate how difficult it is to move hydrogen around the world. And they also underestimate the amount of energy that we're going to need to be moving from areas where we have great renewable energy to the demand centres. There's just not enough good quality renewable energy close to demand centres for us to be able to rely only on that to be able to feed demand centres such as Europe and big cities in the United States. So we're going to have to start moving big quantities of energy, renewable energy around the world. And the most efficient way to do that is through e-fuels. If you look in nature, the way the energy is stored is using carbon and hydrogen, carbohydrates, and e-fuels are ultimately mimicking that. So we think that we're going to see a lot of movement of these sorts of products over the medium term. And as Matt said, we think that that's going to be starting in the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to see more and more of this.
Ralf, I wanted to ask you about sustainable air travel. What do you have to say about that, and what can we expect to come?
Well, as pointed out before, I think, or we think, e-fuels are the only solution. It's not very likely that we will see electric planes soon. Maybe we never will see them, I don't know. There is some interesting developments going on with hydrogen and fuel cell planes, but all of this, I think, is very far away. And if you see the production cycles and the cycles, how long planes are run usually, it's very unlikely that we will see other technology solution in terms of how the planes are run in the future. So we need e-kerosene. I think Mats is very competent in that respect to talk about that more in detail. But again, the very question is, how do we get the uptake of production of e-kerosene for the air industry all over the world? And I don't think, for example, in Europe, the thinking of many regulators is we just do a quota for planes, a fuel quota for planes, and that's it. But this will not work because the fuels will be too expensive then if you only think about e-kerosene. It's also because if you produce e-kerosene, you also have other modes in the refinery process as well. The road transport sector has by far the highest abatement costs per ton CO2. Right now, car manufacturers pay around 500 euros per ton avoided CO2, and that's basically electrification. That's by far the most expensive solution we have on the market right now. So why not use the car area to foster and to push e-fuel production And that will also gain advantages for the airlines, because if you produce diesel and fuel, gasoline, you also produce e-kerosene as well. But you need the big plants to do so. And I think this is key to use all the leverage we have from different sectors to provide the solutions for different sectors as well. That's about sector connection, actually. I think that's the way forward.
Clara, I want to ask you, instead of looking forward, I want to look back now and ask you, what is perhaps one of the most surprising things that's happened in recent years with regards to this technology there in Chile?
Well, I think that we're probably pretty close to being at the beginning of the road here, so I can't say that we can look back too far and talk about things that have happened in the past. But I would say instead about how excited I am for the future. I think that even though there are some challenges, as Ralf has mentioned, in the regulatory framework, I think that there is great progress being made towards recognizing e-fuels in Europe and the potential that they can have. And I see, as we have discussions with regulators all around the world, that this is something that people are starting to realize, that actually, even though electrification is a fantastic tool towards climate change, there are other tools that are required if we're really going to get serious about getting to 2050 on a carbon neutral or net zero basis. And so I'm just really excited about what is going to happen in the near future and over the medium term as this realization grows. We as a company are completely convinced that e-fuels are needed for us to be able to approach our climate targets. And so I think that we're at the start of a very exciting industry that's just going to be growing and growing over the next few years. So we're very happy to be a part of it.
Clara, thank you for that. And before we end our discussion, Ralf, Mats, is there anything else you would like to add?
Maybe just one thing about, because that fits very good to what Carla just said, it's about industry policy as well. I think that's an aspect of e-fuels and hydrogen production we should not underestimate. Compared to electrification, the major part of an electric car is the battery. It's basically coming from Asia right now. We are restarting production of battery cells in Europe now. But the major players are from Asia. That is very different in the field of e-fuels and hydrogen production. We have companies which are members of the eFuel Alliance, like Siemens Energy, for example. They are world leading in the electrolyzer technology. So far, we do not have a mass production of electrolyzers in the world because it was not needed so far. But there are 100,000 of new jobs available in Europe if we just would promote this technology, and it's European technology. I think that is something which is very often underestimated. So even if the fuels come from China, most of the technology we are talking about is actually coming from Europe, or in this case from Germany.
We just need to catch up a little bit there.
Right.
Matt, anything you want to add before we conclude our discussion?
Yeah, we talked about change here and looking back a bit, and what I find really interesting is what happened now with the corona situation and green deals, and more companies realizing they need to do things differently. So just the last 1.5 years, we've seen such a change in both for our sustainable aviation fuel, although we have had it since many years now, and Lufthansa have been running with it since 2011 and so on, but now it's really taken off here. And also with our HVO and renewable diesel, we have about 500 stations. And the network is growing, but we see so many other players coming into the game now and also investing in this. And this we see it, there are competitors, but we see it so positive because the availability will increase. Mm-hmm. And I think once you start having the fuel and having the fuels available around you, then also you get to know it, and you can understand more about what the impact it can have. So I think it's really positive, the change that we're seeing now, and so how many companies are really moving into this area. So competition is a good thing. Yes.
I want to thank you very much, Mats, Ralf, and Clara. Thank you so much for joining me on this panel today. We are going to take a very short break, but don't go anywhere. In about 10 minutes, we'll be back with the grand finale for Shift. I'll see you then.